Well, church, we are continuing on in a really fun message series. We're having fun, anyways, up here as we're sharing these stories, because we're in a series. If you haven't been with us, a series called "Stories You Thought You Knew." Maybe stories that you heard growing up, maybe stories that you've only ever heard from TV, which doesn't always represent some of the Bible stories particularly well. Maybe it's stories that you've just heard by association and references made. And you may be wondering, why are we going through this series about some of these stories that we thought we knew? And really, the reason for it comes from 2 Timothy chapter 3, when it says that we have these holy scriptures which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith in Jesus Christ. All the stories of Scripture, all of the things that we see throughout Scripture really are about a unified story that points us towards Jesus and finding salvation in Him. And so we're digging into some of these stories. We're maybe digging a little deeper than we've dug before into these stories, so that through them we see Jesus and what He's done for us, what He calls us to in life. So that's why we're going through these, and also, frankly, because it's a lot of fun. So I hope you guys are enjoying this as much as we are, and we're going to dig into another one today that maybe if you're of my particular age, which I won't necessarily confess to today, you've seen this story on flannel graph. Anybody, flannel graph? Anybody remember flannel graph? Yeah, okay, it was a thing. Anyways, so some of these stories that we're going through seem to be stories, and they're often framed as stories about these incredible heroes of the faith, heroes of the Bible that, we see their life and we're supposed to imitate their life, maybe we feel like, because there's principles for us to learn from them and the way they did things. Maybe models for us to model our life after. Now, the only problem with the Bible presenting us with a whole bunch of good moral examples is that the Bible is also honest. It's honest. This is not actually a problem with the Bible. It's a good thing about the Bible. But it's honest about how people actually lived. And sometimes those great moral examples that we want to look to in the Bible weren't actually such great moral examples. And today we're going to look at a heroic story that really wasn't that heroic. As we consider Samson, the story of Samson. Now, when I was thinking about how this story, I think, often gets told, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the way that this has been framed, at least in my experience of this, is that we have the hero Samson, who's off doing the work of God, dealing with the Philistines. The Philistines being the enemies of Israel, and Samson's off taking care of them. And then the antagonist of the story is Delilah, who's the scheming villain who comes along and tricks Samson into revealing the source of his strength so it can be taken away, he can be captured, and then this hero eventually gets his revenge in the end. But it's sort of like hero Samson, villain Delilah, who destroys his life. But quite honestly, that's a really shallow reading of the story that's not really true to what happens. There's some truth in it, but there's a lot more to it. So we're going to be digging deeper into the story of Samson today, and we're not going to read all of Judges 13 to 16, but we will read a portion kind of through it just to frame the story for us. But I want to start by setting the stage for you. And this is sort of consistent from last week, if you were here last week to hear the story of Gideon. Setting the stage in the book of Judges in particular. In the book of Judges, we're at a time where Israel has come out of slavery in Egypt. They've made it through the wilderness. They're in the promised land. They've experienced some great victories, taken over some of the land. And now we're in a season where we see a pattern happen with God's people, Israel. What they tend to do is they tend to do evil, kind of going alongside with what all the other nations in the land were doing, worshiping other gods and things like that, and doing terrible things as they did that. So then things would go badly, and God would give Israel over, it would say, to one of the other nations that were still in the promised land, and they would oppress Israel for a while. Last week it was the nation of Midian, who was oppressing Israel for a period of 7 years. They would keep coming from the east of the Jordan and raiding the Israelites and taking their stuff. When that would happen, the Israelites would be freaking out. They'd cry out to God. God would send them a judge to rescue them. Really a leader to come and lead them and rescue them. And then they would have a period of peace, and then they would go right back to doing evil. And if you read the whole of the book of Judges, which if you read it, PG-13 probably isn't a high enough rating for all that's in there. So Anyways, it's a little nasty, but if you read it, you see this pattern happen again and again and again. So as we start into chapter 13 in the story of Samson, we see that they've restarted this same cycle. This is chapter 13, verse 1. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. So the Lord delivered them into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years. 40 years. I mean, last time it was 7 years with Gideon. 40 years. JP, who was leading worship up here, celebrated his 40th birthday not long ago. That's like sorry. Okay, listen, I'll fess up. I'm 48, okay? There you go. But, that's your whole life. Your whole life living under oppression of a foreign power in your own land. The Philistines, instead of being on the east side of the Jordan, they were off to the west in Israel, kind of the southwest, right against the Mediterranean Sea. And they were oppressing Israel for 40 years. But God intervenes again. His angel of the Lord comes down and meets with the wife of a man named Manoah. We don't even know her name. But he meets with this woman in this little tribe of Dan up in the north of Israel. And he comes to announce his plan. And this is what he says. The angel of the Lord appeared to her and said, "You are barren and childless, but you're going to become pregnant and give birth to a son. Now see to it that you drink no wine or other fermented drink, and that you do not eat anything unclean. You will become pregnant and have a son whose head is never to be touched by a razor, because the boy is to be a Nazirite, dedicated to God from the womb. He will take the lead in delivering Israel from the hand of the Philistines." So similarly to Gideon, God comes and selects a completely unsuspecting, unimpressive person who is going to come and bring deliverance to his people. And don't you love how God does this? There's so many times, so many stories in Scripture where we see God coming to a woman and saying, "You're barren, you can't have kids," which in those days was a really nasty sentence against you. But you're going to have a child. Maybe in old age, maybe, well past what you thought was possible. You're going to have a child, and I'm going to use your child for a special purpose. And that's what God says he's going to do. And so he sets apart Samson, this child that Manoah and his wife are going to have. And he sets him apart with a particular purpose. The purpose being that he is going to deliver God's people Israel from the oppression that they're experiencing from the Philistines that they've been putting up with for 40 years. And not only does he have a special purpose, but he's going to look a little different too. He's going to act a little different, live a little different, because he is going to be a Nazirite, it said in the text. A Nazirite designated as God's chosen one so that people would know this is God's doing. Now, if you want to find out what a Nazirite is about, you can go back to the book of Numbers, chapter 6. In the process of giving the law to his people, God kind of talked about this thing of a Nazirite vow, which was a special vow that anybody was able to make if they wanted to be set apart for a purpose for God, for whatever it was. And it was usually for a limited time. In a sense, Samson's mom was set aside in a similar way and told that she wasn't allowed to have any alcohol while she was pregnant. Like, that was just not going to be a thing. So anybody could do this. Anybody could take a Nazirite vow. Now, Samson himself, we don't actually see any record of him making a Nazirite vow. We just know that God set him apart to be a Nazirite, and he was supposed to live under the rules of a Nazirite. And if you go back to Numbers chapter 6, you'll find out there's three main requirements for living with a Nazirite vow. Number one, no alcohol. You don't drink any alcohol for the period of your vow. So for Samson, of course, because he's set apart from birth, all through his life, that would be his entire life. Second requirement, you don't cut your hair. No razors to be taken to your head. You just keep growing your hair for the whole period that your vow lasts. Again, for Samson, that's his whole life. And finally, you don't touch any dead bodies. A number of months ago, we talked about the significance of dead bodies and why it made you unclean. And really, it's about associating with death as opposed to associating with God who brings life. That's a really short and simple explanation. But there was a sense of don't touch any dead bodies because you're set apart for the life-giving God and his purposes. So, So far, so good, right? God's got a plan in place. He has selected a deliverer. He's given some requirements for how his deliverer is supposed to act so that people can see that he is the instrument of God bringing about the deliverance of his people from the Philistines. Looking good, right? So, how'd it go? Well, let's jump into chapter 14. Samson went down to Timnah. This is the first we actually read about Samson doing something. Samson went down to Timnah and saw there a young Philistine woman. When he returned, he said to his father and mother, "I've seen a Philistine woman in Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife." Of course, days of arranged marriages, things went a little different in terms of how that all went. But one of the problems here is that Samson went and found himself a Philistine to marry, which actually goes against the Old Testament law in Exodus 34:16. Which talks about the fact that the Israelites were not supposed to intermarry with the other nations of that land, because what would happen is, if you got married to someone in that land, you would probably adopt their gods as your own, start to worship them, and then you'd be committing idolatry and not following the ways of Yahweh, their God. But Samson decides to go down anyways. Goes down to a Philistine village. It's about 4 miles southwest of where his house was, across the valley of Sorek. You can keep that name in mind. Comes back later. And goes and sees a really cute-looking girl that he wants to marry. Now, the interesting piece about this is, in the text, which we didn't read it yet, but if you keep reading, you find it, it actually says that this is from the Lord. Because the Lord was actually looking to create an opportunity where he could bring deliverance from his people from the Philistines. He wanted to stir up trouble with the Philistines. Which seems a little odd, that God would say something and give an instruction to do something that actually seems counter to his law. But it's also odd, really, that God would choose Samson as his people's deliverer, as we're going to see. So let's keep reading. Verse 5. Samson went down to Timnah, second time, together with his father and mother. As they approached the vineyards of Timnah, suddenly a young lion came roaring toward him. The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him so that he tore the lion apart with his bare hands, as he might have torn a young goat. But he told neither his father nor his mother what he had done. Then he went down and talked with the woman, and he liked her. Well, love story's going well so far, at least, so that's good. And this is the first sign that we actually see of Samson's strength. Defeating this lion on his way to Timnah, when the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him, which is a familiar phrase throughout the book of Judges. This is constant. The Spirit of the Lord coming along upon these judges to deliver his people. Now, Samson goes down with his parents. They meet the girl. Things start to get set up. And later he goes back to marry his wife. And on the way back down to Timnah again, he comes across the carcass of the lion that he killed on this trip. And at this point, there's been bees that have formed a hive in the lion's carcass. And there's honey that Samson sees. And so he dips his hand into the lion carcass to get out some of the honey and eat it. What's the problem with that? Dead body. Strike one. Already breaking one of the requirements of his Nazirite vow. So, they head down to Timnah, though, him and his family. Verse 10. His father went down to see the woman, and there Samson held a feast as was customary for young men. So this is now, they're getting married. And Samson is throwing a 7-day feast. And when you see the word feast, by the way, Bible 101 people, what should we do when we see words like this? We go and we look them up and see what this word actually do a little bit of a deeper dive. And when we do a deeper dive into the word feast, what it really implies is he threw a 7-day drinking party. Which is not uncommon in the ancient world. You know, same thing at the start of the book of Esther, when King Xerxes threw in a huge feast. This is like just a nonstop drinking party. In fact, he gives the order that no one's cup, they can drink as much as they want. Oftentimes, kings would say, just keep filling the glasses of everybody so it never actually hits the bottom. And you had a round bottom cup so you couldn't set it down. So this is not uncommon to have a big drinking feast. But Samson throws this big drinking party. So we see not explicitly in the text, but implied in the text, that he also breaks another one of the Nazirite commitments, to not drink any alcohol. Strike two. While he's down there at the party, He ends up having 30 companions. I often think a wedding party of 5 people on each side gets a little big because it gets a little crowded on the stage, but he had 30, so go figure. Anyways, 30 companions that were hanging out with him. And he says to them, "Let me tell you a riddle." Samson said to them, "If you can give me the answer within the 7 days of the feast, I'll give you 30 linen garments and 30 sets of clothes. If you can't tell me the answer, you must give me 30 linen garments and 30 sets of clothes." "Tell us your riddle," they said. "Let's hear it. We're in." So he replied, "Out of the eater, something to eat. Out of the strong, something sweet." Now, of course, we know the answer to that riddle, right? I mean, because we've been following along the story. But for 3 days, 3 of the 7 days of the feast, they could not think of what the answer was. So Solomon, I've been doing this all week, thinking Samson and getting Solomon out of my mouth. Samson, he's drinking, adding a little bit of gambling to the whole thing. Let's up the ante and the stakes a little bit. Let's make this a little more exciting. So he tells this riddle, they can't figure it out. And what they end up doing, these 30 companions of Samson, is they threaten his wife. They go to her and say, "You get the answer for us, or else we're going to torch your father's household and kill him and you." See why Judges isn't like PG-13? It's awful. And, not surprisingly, she gives in. And she goes to Samson again and again and again, and with tears and crying and pleading for her life. He may not have known that at the time, but pleading for her life and the life of her father, she pleads for an answer. And finally, Samson gives it to her and tells her the solution to the riddle, which she, of course, passes on to Samson's companions, and they give it to him, and he is absolutely enraged. So, now we get to see Samson's first act of vengeance, because he goes down and attacks the city of Ashkelon to kill 30 people and take their clothes to pay for his gambling debt. And again, the Spirit of the Lord comes on him to give him the strength to kill these 30 people. It's crazy, right? Now, just so you get a sense of where Ashkelon is, I thought I'd throw this map up here for you. So Samson lived up in this region right up here at the right side of the map. And Timnah is where he met his wife and where they were having the big party. Now, when you think about where he was going to go to get the clothes, this whole area is Philistine territory under here. So he could have gone to Ekron, a lot closer, Gath, pretty close, Ashdod, even closer. But Samson actually goes all the way down here to Ashkelon on the coast. Probably, I would assume, because he didn't want word of this coming back so that it would cause a threat to his family if people found out where he got these clothes from. So he goes a long ways. I don't know how many days it took him to get there and back, but Samson goes, kills these 30 people, brings back their clothing. And after all this, he is still so mad that he just leaves his wife in Timnah and goes home with his parents afterwards, still burning with anger. But the anger doesn't last forever, and Samson wants to come back and see his wife. Not surprisingly, he thought she was pretty good looking, right? Wants to go spend some time with her. So, chapter 15, later on, at the time of the wheat harvest, Samson took a young goat and went to visit his wife. He said, "I'm going to my wife's room." But her father would not let him go in. "I was so sure you hated her," he said, "that I gave her to your companion, one of those 30. Isn't her younger sister more attractive? Take her instead." Option B. Samson said to them, "This time I have a right to get even with the Philistines. I will really harm them. Now they've asked for it." So Samson, now, second instance of vengeance, comes to visit his wife, finds her given away. So instead, he goes out and ruins some of the fields of the Philistines. He catches foxes, ties them together by the tail, puts torches in, and lets them run crazy in the fields of the Philistines. And it was the time of wheat harvest. So now their wheat's just coming to be, and they're ready to harvest and get their food. And now Samson set these things loose to burn their fields. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, the Philistines get pretty upset, understandably. And so they find out the reason why Samson did this, because of his father-in-law giving away his daughter to someone else. And so the Philistines come and they kill the father-in-law and the daughter. They follow through on the threat they gave in the first place with the riddle. And now Samson even gets more enraged, and he goes to kill more of them. But it's not just the Philistines at this point who are upset with Samson. Let's keep reading in verse 11. Then 3,000 men from Judah, these are of the people of Israel, these are their brothers and sisters. They went down to the cave in the rock of Etam and said to Samson, "Don't you realize that the Philistines are rulers over us? What have you done to us?" He answered, "I merely did to them what they did to me." Is that junior high or what? They started it. You guys with kids have probably never heard that in your homes, have you? Anyways, they said to him, "We've come to tie you up and hand you over to the Philistines." Samson said, "Swear to me that you won't kill me yourselves." "Agreed," they answered. "We'll only tie you up and hand you over to them. We will not kill you." So they bound him with 2 new ropes and let him up from the rock. As he approached Lehi, the Philistines came toward him shouting. The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him. The ropes on his arms became like charred flax, and the bindings dropped from his hands. Finding a fresh jawbone of a donkey, he grabbed it and struck down 1,000 men. Isn't that crazy how strong this guy was? Seriously. Now you got to wonder, how were the people who came from Judah to tell Samson off feeling after he kills another 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey? They must be freaking out at this point. Samson is just feeling thirsty. And so after he kills all these people, he just asks the Lord for a drink, which God provides him from a spring. How are we doing so far? You guys enjoying Samson's story? Some fun stuff, right? Well, that's now through chapter 15. As we get into chapter 16, we see Samson's woman trouble continue along. He just had all sorts of problems with women. Chapter 16, verses 1 and 2. One day Samson went to Gaza, where he saw a prostitute. He went in to spend the night with her. The people of Gaza were told, "Samson is here." So they surrounded the place and lay in wait for him all night at the city gate. They made no move during the night, saying, "At dawn, we'll kill him." Okay, this time Samson actually goes not to a border town, but right into the heart of Philistine territory. And he goes to see a prostitute. This guy, moral example? Oh, man, I don't think so. Philistines try and trap him in the town. Again, his desires are getting him in so much hot water, right? They continue to put him in places of trouble. But Samson, in the midst of all this, actually during the night just gets up, picks up the city gates, tears them out of the wall, and carries them off to a nearby hillside and drops them off there. And he escapes from the city. Seriously, what the heck? But that's not the end of his women troubles. No. We haven't even touched Delilah yet, right? Well, here we go. Verse 4. Sometime later, he fell in love with a woman in the valley of Sorek. Where was the valley of Sorek? Right near home. Between home and Timnah. That was the valley of Sorek that ran across. Whose name was Delilah. The rulers of the Philistines went to her and said, "See if you can lure him into showing you the secret of his great strength and how we can overpower him so we may tie him up and subdue him. Each one of us will give you 1,100 shekels of silver for that information." Now, by the time we actually get to Delilah's story, and Delilah's part of Samson's story, do you see how messy Samson's story is already? It's not like he's this incredible hero who now Delilah is going to dethrone. He's a really complicated, messy, broken hero if he's a hero at all, maybe an anti-hero. But then we come to see his time with Delilah. Incidentally, again, Bible 101 people, when you see a name in the Bible, what should you do? Maybe check out what it means. The name Delilah means delicate or feeble. And I think we actually see that carried out in what she does. Now, just a quick little note, too, for you. I mentioned the Valley of Sorek kind of is right between there, between Israelite and Philistine territory. You can see Timnah in there in the valley. And so from somewhere in that valley is where she lived. One of the things we actually don't know about Delilah is whether she was Hebrew or Philistine. The name Delilah is actually a Hebrew name, even though I know there's lots of places that we associate her with the Philistines because the Philistines come and ask her for this information, but we don't actually know. What we do know, and what we are sure of, is that she did take a bribe from the Philistines to get the secret of Samson's strength, which, again, I think was really a sign of her feeble character, not being able to stand up against that. But Delilah does what Samson's other wife did. Nags, cajoles, bugs, tests Samson's words to find out if he's actually given her the answer yet. Now, don't you think Samson would have got this play by now? Like, he's seen this before. Like, dude, learn from the first time. And yet, he finally does relent and tells Delilah the truth, which, unsurprisingly, she passes on to the Philistines. And they come and they shave his head, because that was what was holding his strength on still. This sign of being a Nazirite, even though he had failed in other ways, he still had the hair uncut. And they come and they shave his head, and the text tells us that he lost his strength. The Spirit of the Lord left him. He lost his strength at that point. And so then the Philistines were easily able to come, bind him with ropes. He couldn't tear out of them. And as they captured him, they gouged out his eyes and set him to work. Strike 3. Now, the final scene of Samson's life is one last act of vengeance that takes place at a Philistine festival. It's right at the end of chapter 16. When they stood him among the pillars, Samson said to the servant who held his hand, "Put me where I can feel the pillars that support the temple, so that I may lean against them." Now the temple was crowded with men and women. All the rulers of the Philistines were there, and on the roof were about 3,000 men and women watching Samson perform. And Samson prayed to the Lord, "Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just one more time, and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." And Samson reached toward the 2 central pillars on which the temple stood. Bracing himself against them, his right hand on the one and his left hand on the other, Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." And he pushed with all his might, and down came the temple on the rulers and all the people in it. One last cry out to God for one last act of vengeance against his enemies for his 2 eyes. Samson, able to push the pillars, killed lots of Philistines along with himself. And tragically, the note in the second part of verse 30 says, "Thus he killed many more when he died than while he lived." He actually had a bigger impact in his death than he did in his life. Isn't that a tragic statement about who Samson was? This story is not so much of a hero epic as it is a tragedy. So we made it through Samson's story. Wow. Thank you for hanging in there with me. I don't know, maybe you're edge of your seats because this is like an interesting story. I don't know. But what a messy story. But what do we do with it? What do we make of Samson? I think, honestly, the assessment of the narrative as it walks us through this whole story of his life is that ultimately Samson was really a blunt instrument of God, used to bring justice against an oppressive people who were harming God's people. Certainly, Samson was an instrument of God. He was set aside with a purpose to deliver his people from the Philistines. He was given a visible sign of his being set apart in that he was a Nazirite. And he was empowered by God to do supernatural things that nobody else could do. But Samson's life was not one about obedience to the Lord or about seeking the Lord for what he should do. It was not really about living set apart for him. In fact, there's only 2 recorded moments of Samson ever calling out to the Lord. One for water when he was thirsty after getting revenge, and the other one in order to take revenge. And those are the only 2 times we actually see Samson calling out to God. Really, Samson, when he was empowered by God, was acting more on the basis of his own desires and his craving for revenge than he was about doing something that God was asking him to do. Over and over, we see this same pattern, right? It's almost like the pattern in Judges. We see a pattern in Samson's life where he's acting because he's been offended or wronged by someone. You know, the friends used his wife to get the information about the riddle, so he was wrong. So therefore, he goes and kills a bunch of people. And then his wife gets given away to someone else, so he's wrong, so he goes and destroys fields. And then they kill his wife and his father-in-law, so then he's wrong, and he goes and kills a bunch of other people. Like, it's just on and on and on. I'm offended, I'm wronged. So I'm going to go kill a bunch of people and ruin their livelihoods. That's Samson's life. And even, did you catch, even in the final act, when he asked to be able to take vengeance on the Philistines one more time, it's not so that his people can finally be delivered from their oppression. It's not so God's purposes will finally be seen. It's for his two eyes. Would you let me get back at these guys for gouging out my eyes? Because that really pissed me off, right? Like, that's what it is. I'm like, are you kidding me? Revenge and vengeance, personal offense, and acts of terror. So, again, what do we make of Samson? Samson may have been used by God, but he is by no means an example to aspire to. Although, as I was thinking about it this week, in some ways, Samson is a fitting hero for the age in which we live. Someone who acts on the basis of the offense they feel and is able to take supernatural vengeance against others who would commit it against them. Aren't there so many people in our world who would love to have that kind of power, to act out against those who offend them? Anyways, that's another sign, or another thought. But maybe the bigger question is, what can we learn from Samson? What can we learn from his life? And just a couple thoughts about that. First of all, God is going to get done what he needs to get done for his kingdom work, regardless of what our part is in that. Regardless of whether his people are obedient or disobedient, God will accomplish what he has set out to do. And we see that again and again through the book of Judges, a really dark time in God's people's history, that God continued to do what he intended to do, regardless of the fact that they were not super obedient. However, even though God can accomplish things no matter what we choose to do, he doesn't want to work through you and me despite you and me. Do you know what I mean? Like, he doesn't actually want to use us as a blunt instrument. Instead, he desires us to live in relationship and partnership with him to accomplish the good things of his kingdom. He wants to actually do this in a loving relationship with you so you can come alongside him and see and participate in the incredible things he's doing. He desires you to know him, to choose to walk in his ways, to be filled with his spirit, to exemplify and overflow the characteristics of who he is in the world. Remember a few years ago, I always say a few years ago, I think it was probably about 6, 5, we were doing the second time through the Hearing God course here at the church. And one of the things we do in the Hearing God course is, as we're teaching you just ways to listen to the voice of God, we also take time for what we call practicum, where we actually take time to listen for what God has to say, so we can learn to hear his voice better. Go figure. Anyways, as we were doing that, and I was leading the session, the question that we were putting out there to the Lord is, what do you like about me? And I was just sitting up there at the front, just, doing the exercise just like everyone else was, and I was just listening. And the thing that struck me was God saying, I love that the way we can talk now is not so clunky as it used to be. Because I try and listen and pay attention to what he's saying. I try and be more attentive to his word and the ways that he's formed me. Now we're able to talk, and he doesn't just have to hit me on the back of the head with a velvet-covered 2x4. I don't know if you guys, I know a few of you have experienced that kind of thing, where God has to direct us through some pretty obvious means. And now there's a greater subtlety in the way that God and I can communicate together. And that's a really beautiful thing. But I think he wants that for all of us. He wants to have that relationship where he can actually steer us and have us doing things in his kingdom without having to whack us over the back of the head or without having to just pick us up despite all of who we are and all of the messes we make, and just use us as a blunt instrument to get something done. The problem for us is, I think there's a little bit of Samson in all of us. A tendency to focus on our own interests, our own desires, to focus on the ways that we have been offended by others, and the things that we would like to do to get back at them. And when we go down that road and live in that world, God can still use us, and he can still do things in and through us, but it's more in spite of us than in relationship with us. And so my question is, wouldn't we rather be partners with God? Wouldn't we rather actually be directed by his Holy Spirit, getting to experience the gifts he wants to place in us and has placed in us, but with the intent of bringing him glory and getting to share in the joy of what he's doing? That's the life he actually invites us to. That's what he wants to share with you. One last thing I wanted to share before we get to our time of response is just a brief epilogue to this story. Just kind of thinking about where this fits in the bigger story of the Bible. Samson is the last of the judges in the book of Judges. He is the last of the judges in this pattern and spiral that we see going down and down and down into evil and devolving into this horrible mess. After that, there's two other stories that read at your own risk kind of stories. But he's not the last judge. The last judge was actually Samuel, who shows up fittingly in the book for Samuel. And Samuel becomes this judge who is not one who will continue this pattern leading into evil, but is a hinge to changing from the judges to the kings in Israel. And he is going to be the one who anoints the first and second king of Israel. Which again, we get to see another pattern that's going to emerge through the kings of Israel, where we see a similar thing through leadership that continues to fall into human evil. But what the kingship does is it points us towards our need for a king who would come, who could live righteously and truly after God's own heart, who would accomplish God's purposes and actually be the one who could lead us in the way that God intended. The whole pattern of the kings that is to come in the rest of the biblical story points us towards Jesus, the one who would actually come and who could lead our lives well. And so as we get to our time of response, really the story of Samson is a story of pointing us towards our own need for Jesus, to be the one who's actually the king of our lives. Because as Samson wrestled with so many of these things and falling into leading his life by his desires and offenses, that's a place that we can tend to go to. And we need a king who can actually restore us and lead us into the life God has for us. So I want to invite the worship team to come on up. Our prayer team is going to head to the prayer room to get ready for that. Our ushers are going to get ready. But we want to take some time of response, church, just to think a little bit and process what God's been saying to us through this story, this messy, messy story of Samson. And as we do that, we have a few ways for you to respond today. First of all, to come to the Lord's table, to come and to eat the bread that represents Jesus' body that was nailed to the cross, to be the atoning sacrifice for our sin, our brokenness, our self-centeredness, our acting out of our desires and offenses. He died to pay the debt of that so that we could be forgiven and have life. And so we come to receive the bread and also to drink the juice that represents a new covenant made in his blood, a new way for us to relate to our God and Father. And so you're welcome to come and to receive the bread and the juice, to take it back to your seat, and as you're ready, you can eat and drink that as a statement of faith in Jesus for what he has done for you. But we also have space for prayer today over in our prayer room off to your right. And maybe in that space of prayer today, it's a space for you where you need to confess a space where you've been acting like Samson, and instead to choose to align your heart and your ways to the ways of God. Whether you have another prayer need that you want to bring, whatever you need to do, feel free to head into the prayer room at any time. And our prayer team, I believe it's Donna and Jim. No, Donna is in there. Donna and Stephen in there. That's right, because Jim's in the back today. Donna and Stephen would love to pray with you about whatever need you have. Our worship team is going to lead us in some great songs that just, again, declare God's glory and hopefully catch up our hearts to want to praise and give him glory for what he's done. And a little later on, our ushers will come in and receive our offering this morning, which is just for us an opportunity to surrender something that's significant in our world back to God, because he is the one who is the source of all things that we have. So church, why don't you stand to start, and let's take some time to respond and spend with our Lord today, and just allow him to speak into our lives as well.